Today, the DFA Financial Pressure Reports for May 2024, Part 5, Families in Stress. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Well, I've noticed post covering finance and property news. Well, this is the fifth in a series of posts that I've released in recent days based on the 2024 survey results. Now, just to remind you, we started by looking at the May results in overview. Then we did a deep dive on mortgage stress, then on rental stress, then on investor stress. And now we're turning to the overall financial stress, which is this show, where we look at the overall impact of all those different types of stress on households. And then there will be one more show, the postcode analysis, where we're going to be responding to specific viewer requests for particular postcodes. So if you have a postcode that you would like me to go through in terms of my analysis, put it in the comments below and I'll try and get to it in the final show, which will be released in a few days' time. And of course, our analysis allows us to look across the whole of the country and across different household groups and segments, looking at mortgage stress, rental stress, investor stress, and the aggregate measure, which is the financial stress metric. And you may recall that we went through in summary form where the overall financial stress was highest. Around half of households across the country are registering some sort of financial stress. This is a cash flow measure. So 50.38% of households, or 4.9 million households, so close to half of families across the country are in difficulty. And interestingly, if you look across the state, you'll see that whilst there is some variation, and the NT, of course, is a very small sample, actually, somewhere between 45 and just over 50% is what the average number is. So the first takeout from this particular piece of analysis is that wherever you are in the country, there's roughly a 50-50 chance of households being in difficulty at the moment, thanks to the pressure of inflation, high rents, and of course, the high mortgage rates. So let's start by going down the financial stress by postcode. These are the top postcodes across the country. And we can see there that the prize is held in postcode 2170, which includes Liverpool, Liverpool South, and a few other areas, Mount Pritchard, Warwick Farm. And there, 73% of households have financial stress pressure. And that translates to about 28,000 households in this particular postcode. Then we go to Toowoomba, that's postcode 4350, and there, of the 47,000 households, we have 27,300 in difficulty at 57.95%. Then we go to Campbelltown, postcode 2560, with 77% in financial stress, and that translates to just over 22,800 households in difficulty. Then we go to Victorian postcode 3029, which includes Hoppers Crossing and Tarnet, with 54% in difficulty, 21,900 out of the 40,000 or so there. Then we go to the centre of Melbourne, postcode 3000, where we have 88% in financial stress. So that's one of the real hotspots, more than 20,000 exposed. And then we go to Dermont Point, Cook and Werribee, postcode 3030, to the west of Perth with 43% or 18,000 in difficulty. Then we come back to New South Wales, postcode 2145, and there we have 59% or 17,900 households in difficulty. Then we go to Queensland, postcode 4300, Springfield, where we have 74% in difficulty at 17,400. Another postcode in Queensland, 4305, Ipswich and surrounding areas, 67% there at 17,000. Then we come back to Victorian postcode 3064, Roxburgh Park and Craigieburn, 49% or 17,000 there. Another postcode in Victoria, 3977, Cranbourne, with 44% and 17,000 in difficulty. Then we go to the regional postcode, Ballarat, 3350 with 60% at 16,000. Then we come back to New South Wales, including Mount Druitt and Minchinbury. And there we have postcode 2770 with 84%, another hotspot, more than 16,000. Then Blacktown, postcode 2418 with 16,500 at 70%. Coomera, postcode 4209 up in Queensland with 66% and 16,000. And the bottom of the list of the top ones is Bundaberg. There we have 44%, but 15,400 households in difficulty. Now, what we can then do is to look in more detail at how this plays out using our geomapping. And of course, the geomapping has both the count of families or households in difficulty and also the percentage of households in a particular postcode in difficulty. And I'm going to go through those two dimensions now for each of the major centres. So as normal, we're going to start in the centre of Sydney. And you can see here how this plays out. Just to remind you again that the blue are the low counts, and we go through the yellows, oranges into reds as the counts go higher. And so now we're looking at the overall count of households that are in difficulty on a cash flow basis. And as we pull out, we can see that there are some. Waterloo, Zetland, 2017 stands out. Western Sydney, of course, will have higher counts. We can see those beginning to come in as we go west. So places like Liverpool, for example, and postcode 2145, another example, Blacktown, 2148. And certainly, if you look at the overall counts, as we pull out, you can see that Western Sydney has a higher count of households relative to those in the east. And that trend continues as we begin to stand back further. But if we turn to financial stress on a percentage basis, and this is now, of course, looking firstly in New South Wales, centred on postcode 2000, the story is rather different. So in and around the centre of the city and to the north of the city, up in North Sydney, postcode 2060 and 2061, Neutral Bay 2089, as well as in Sydney itself from Sydney 2000, Pyrmont 2009, and Ultimo 2007, out to Camperdown, and even to Ashfield 2131 and Summerhill 2130, we start to see significant proportions of households in difficulty. The trend continues as we go down to look at Waterloo 2017 and North Bondi 2026, Randwick 2031, and Strathfield 2136 is also registering. As we pull out, Parramatta stands out, Harris Park 2150, 2064 to the north up towards Willoughby, and once again we see the hotspots of Blacktown and Campbelltown, and to an extent Liverpool too. But the point I want to make is that in percentage terms, there is much more stress in the eastern suburbs of Sydney than the absolute counts would actually suggest. And that is because whilst the population densities are lower, there are higher proportions of people in difficulty. And remember that the red means that 81% and above of households in these areas have cash flow difficulties. Once again, of course, it's a patchwork. There are others where the levels are much, much lower. Now I'm going to look at the financial counts in and around Melbourne. We start in postcode 3000, and immediately we can see that there's a problem. In the centre of Victoria, a lot of people are in difficulty, so high counts there. As we pull out, we can see that there are quite a few yellow coded areas, so reasonably high levels of stress. But the centre of Melbourne really stands out. And it's not until we actually pull quite a long way out and we see that over in the west around Wyndham, 3029, we find similar issues. And as we continue to pull out further and further, We start to see then levels of pressure to the north, postcode 3064, and also down beyond Casey, 3810, 3805, 3806, down towards Frankston as well. And there are a few other areas like Ballarat where we've also got significant pressures. So the point to make here again is it's very much a patchwork quilt here. Some areas not doing too badly, others where we've got very high counts. But I must say that the postcode 3029 really stands out. And no surprise from the analysis that we've seen in previous shows. Now turning to the financial stress percent, centered on Victorian postcode 3000. Again, we can see that in the centre of Melbourne, there are quite a few postcodes with high proportions. North Melbourne 3051, West Melbourne 3003, and Parkville 3052. And as we pull out, again, the story is much, much more significant closer to the city than looking at the absolute counts, because the population densities are lower, but in places like Richmond 3121 and Hawthorn 3122, or St Kilda, there are significant pressures. And as we pull out, things continue as we might expect. The areas to the west, to the north, and to the east show significant signs. Whittlesea is a real hotspot, 3750, and postcode 3808 beyond Casey. And then the postcodes in the 3807, 3809, 3810 are all showing up. So the observation here is that the percentage story highlights some significant variations relative to the absolute counts of households. Now I'm going to do the analysis of financial stress counts starting on postcode 4000 and around Brisbane. And as we pull out, well, the population densities are somewhat lower here, so you would not be surprised to find that the proportion in red is somewhat lower, although there are still some areas where we've got quite high counts. And as we pull out, we can see that there are a few coming in like Ipswich, no surprise unfortunately there, 4305, 4300, and down on the Gold Coast, 4207 is another area of concern. And of course, Toowoomba 4350 really stands out as a very significant hotspot right near the top of our list. Beyond that, you can see that areas around Ipswich and areas around the Gold Coast, and north of the Gold Coast in particular, are in some difficulty. Turning to the financial stress percentage analysis centred on postcode 4000 in Brisbane, again, close into the centre of town, we see quite a few postcodes where there are high proportions, 81% or more. 4006 up towards Bowen Hills and Fortitude Valley, down in the Highgate Hill area, 4101 stands out, as well as the centre of town in 4000 itself. And as we pull out, we can see that the sea of red is quite concentrated close into the centre of the city. Now, of course, the combination of high rents and high property costs there are all part of the problem. As we pull out, again, we see the normal suspects in a way to the south and to the west. Ipswich, of course, is always on the radar somewhere. As we go down towards Logan, there are some hotspots there, 4132 and 4131, as well as the Gold Coast. Not quite so hot as some others. And as we pull out, of course, we also see that Toowoomba is registering. Now, not registering quite so hot as some, but is still up there. Now looking at Adelaide, postcode 5000, looking at financial stress counts once again, we can see that the population densities are somewhat lower here. So therefore, the absolute counts tend to be somewhat lower than in the Sydney or Melbourne metropolitan areas. Worth noting that there are a few areas where the counts are a little higher, so we're up in the yellows. But relatively speaking, compared with some of the other areas that we've been looking at, the pressure in and around Adelaide, in terms of the absolute number within a particular postcode, remains relatively low. However, we will see some rather different trends when we turn to look at the percentage of households which are actually in difficulty. Now, looking at the Adelaide story for financial stress on a percentage basis, we can see that the percentages are somewhat higher into the centre of town, 5,000, 5,067, 5,033. And as we pull out, a few other hotspots are also emerging from Norton Summit, 5,136 inland, and then down towards Plympton and South Plympton towards the coast. Postcode 5094 around the Salisbury area is registering. That's one of the hot spots that we see some of the highest proportions there. So the story is still that the pressure on households in and around Adelaide are a little lower, but once again it's a patchwork quilt, and there are some areas where there are very significant pressures. Now here we're looking at the financial stress count in and around the centre of Perth. Again, the population density tends to be somewhat lower in Perth relative to some other areas. So no surprise to see that the absolute level of stress is still relatively low compared with the national counts. That said, there are some hotspots, 6065. Unfortunately, that comes up quite often to the north of Perth, and as we pull out further, a few other areas also are registering. But really, comparatively speaking, the absolute count levels are relatively low, although that strip to the north and particularly away from the coast is showing some difficult signs. Looking at the financial stress centred on Perth, postcode 6000, we can see that postcode 6004 East Perth is registering as a high percentage in difficulty. And as we pull out, we can see that there are quite a few others, particularly towards the Ascot area, 6104, 6051 Marylands, Rivervale 6103, Victoria Park 6100, and East Victoria Park 6101. As we begin to stand back a little further, we can see there that there are a few other ones. St James 6102 stands out as a real hotspot, along with East Perth, and then some up to the north. Interestingly, Wanneroo is a little lower as a percentage, but as we showed earlier on, there's a high density there, of course. And as we pull out, we can see a few other places on the coast, 6034, 6038, 6036, high growth corridors, lots of homeland packages, lots of new purchases there, a lot of properties really squeezed in. Rockingham also shows 6172, again, a high proportion of people in difficulty, as well as in the Serpentine area, 6123 and 6122. So you can see, again, the distribution of the percentages do vary across the Greater Perth region. And if we look at Hobart and Tasmania, again, the counts are quite low because the population density is somewhat lower. So it gives you a bit of a flavour, but of course, again, because of the lower population densities, the absolute counts on a national basis will be somewhat lower than in the urban centres of Sydney and Melbourne. Nevertheless, if you look north of Hobart, there are areas like in 7010 and 7011, as well as across in the Mornington area. The counts are somewhat higher in these areas. And now looking at the Hobart story, and here in percentage terms, we see quite considerable pressures in 7009 around Moona, as well as across the other side there on the Mornington area, 7018. And down the coast, 7019 in the Tranmere area and Clarendon Vale. The point I want to make is that, again, we see A somewhat different story in percentage terms relative to the absolute count of households. The former, of course, looking at population density, the latter looking at the percentage of households in difficulty, whether it's rental stress, mortgage stress, or investor stress. So as we come to the end of our analysis, I think there are three observations worth making. The first, of course, is that it's a patchwork story. There are some areas doing quite well, perhaps more affluent areas. There are others doing less well. But as we saw from our earlier focus on segments, pretty much all segments have some degree of pressure. It rather does vary. The second point is that the financial flow pressures are very considerable on all different types of households, whether they're in the rental sector, whether in the mortgage sector, or whether they're actually investors. And in some cases, we are seeing households who have multiple centers of stress. So, for example, they've got investment problems as well as paying rent or paying their mortgage. So there is a considerable story here to tell. And interestingly, I've noticed that quite a few of those households are in relatively new properties bought recently, but also some properties now that were purchased previously. And in some cases, some people renting for quite long periods of time. But because of the incessant pressure with regard to inflation and the cost of living and the fact that wages in real terms are not rising for many people, it's a real mess. Now, I will just remind you, of course, that it is important to reach for help if you have this sort of financial pressure. There's a very important message here about reaching for the right help. And the National Debt Helpline on 1-800-007-007 is a good point of contact. I recommend that relative to some others where you may be asked to pay for advice or pay for restructuring of mortgages and things. The Debt Helpline is government backed and is a much more reliable source of help. So if you are in difficulty, there is help there available. I will also remind you that if you are interested in having an individual conversation with me about a particular suburb using my data, that is available by the DFA one-to-one service. I can't give specific financial advice, but I can look at the data, looking at how it plays out in a particular postcode or suburb and look at the underlying trends. I can look at stress home price trend data and also think about where things may be going from a scenario perspective. It takes about an hour to have a Zoom or a phone conversation. There is a cost involved simply because there's a lot of work to do to be able to put this together. And we are taking bookings. We're booking about 3 to 5 weeks out at the moment because of the high demand. But if you are interested, you can connect via the DFA blog, send me a message and we can sort something out. Now, the other point to make is that I do have detailed information down to an individual postcode level. Here's a sample in the Wollongong area, and this incorporates all of my analysis based on the stress information, the property mix, the profile of individual households and the disposable income, and also some thoughts as to what the price scenarios might be. Now, if you are interested in looking at a specific postcode, you can send a message to me in the comments below and I'll try and incorporate it in my next show. I actually have data on more than 2,000 postcodes in the model. So that is available and it is quite powerful when you see how different postcodes are behaving. And it even touches things like gross investment yield and net investment yields, which do vary quite considerably, as well as the average taxable income and, of course, the price scenarios ahead, as well as the concentration of stress. And I will just make the point that if you'd like to get more information about what we do, you can go to walktheworld.com.au, and there you can see how we collaborate with, for example, Nucleus Wealth. We also have our blog. The DFA blog contains a lot more data, of course. Here's the link as well. And there's the little messaging tool down at the bottom right-hand side of that if you'd like to send me a message. We also can provide information via Patreon. We get quite a lot of support actually from our Patreon members, and if you'd like to contribute to that, then you can do that. The Patreon URL is there as well. But the other point to make is that if you're interested in grabbing the data for more than 2,000 postcodes across the country, you can subscribe and get the data set directly. It's $50 per month plus GST, and we send it out about the 10th of the following month. And as I say, that contains the detailed information as I showed you earlier on, but for every postcode in our analysis. And that's updated every month. So that might be a useful source of information for people, particularly if you want to do your own comparative modeling between different suburbs and postcodes. The information is at a postcode level. And if you'd like to support me via PayPal, you can make a one-off contribution to what we do. Again, it really helps just to cover some of the costs of our analysis, which is pretty extensive. And there's a lot of work involved and cost involved in producing the information each month. So thank you for bearing with me through these past few shows. I'd be very interested to get your feedback as to whether this approach to sharing our information worked better for you than through our live show. And I'll consider then doing this again next month, or going back to a live show, or doing something else. So put your comments below. And to remind you again, if you have a particular postcode that you would like me to incorporate in the final show in the series, which will be out in a few days' time, then we can do that and make sure that you put the postcode in so I can pick it up and then report on it. Anyway, thank you for following through on all of this. I think the bottom line is that we're going to see significant more pressure for a quite long period of time. I'm not sure that government policy is pushing in the right direction. I think inflation will stay higher for longer, and that's going to have a significant impact. I think that we've got a mortgage problem. We've also got a rental problem. I think high migration is partly to blame there. And of course, one of the critical pressure points is also the very high costs of energy. And in a recent show, I highlighted that, of course, we've got massive issues with regard to what's going on there. And unfortunately, I think, again, government policy has let us down. So the takeout ultimately is that the grief that's been caused is not just an accident. It is actually a result of deliberate government policy. They could change, but of course the question is, will they? I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.